Strategy is the first piece of great product leadership, but the second one is prioritization. When I step in as an advisor, or I've stepped into companies and I've seen them fighting about prioritization, it's almost always the root cause is because they haven't agreed on the strategy. And so I think good leaders reverse that order completely. They start with the strategy, everyone's aligned, you know how to measure it. You can then have thoughtful debates about prioritization because that's the hard part in software.
Today, my guest is Adam Nash. During his time as president and CEO of Wealthfront, he scaled assets under management from 100 million to over $4 billion. Before Wealthfront, Adam led product and growth teams at some of Silicon Valley's biggest companies, holding leadership roles at Apple, eBay, LinkedIn, and Dropbox. He's also a prolific angel investor, having invested in global unicorns like Figma, OpenDoor, and Gusto. Adam's passion for delighting customers really is infectious, and he's proven he's one of the most successful leaders in fintech ever. Currently, Adam is leading his latest startup, Daffy, a company that's democratizing charitable giving through donor-advised funds. In today's conversation, we'll cover what trust really means in the world of finance, his biggest lessons from working with Steve Jobs, and the importance of product leadership. Before we start, if you're a marketer in financial services, and like many of my guests, you're noticing that it's getting harder and harder to acquire customers, reach out to our team. We have over 1 million active, engaged retail investors that subscribe to Finimize, and find out if we can help grow your brand or elevate your content at finimize.com/business. Now here's my conversation with Adam Nash. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the Generation Podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure to chat with you because I was thinking, and we were just talking about it, about how I used to read your blog back in the day, like 10, 15 years ago, just starting out in fintech. And the real value I got from it was the way that you're explaining the markets and the economy in a way that someone that wasn't from a finance background could actually understand. So thanks for writing it back then. It served me well. And Finimize didn't exist. So I ended up going on to a company that focused on doing exactly that.
Well, it turns out I've always been interested in personal finance topics. I've talked about in the past a little bit of my journey there, but it's been amazing for me that actually fintech allowed me to bring that together with my software kind of in design background. Going back to college, I think my senior project was a better Quicken. This is back in the 90s. So it's actually been fantastic to have the industry kind of progress to the point where I could actually work on topics and things that I've always found so interesting.
But why was that you're interested in finance? You're an engineer, right? When you started out?
Yeah. It's a very personal story, and I've told it before, but I think like a lot of people, it started with a little bit of interest, but making mistakes, right? So I remember, I think it was after my sophomore year, I got my first internship as a software engineer, and it paid a lot of money. And what I mean by that is I remember sitting down at the Stanford bookstore, like coffee shop, and talking to the guy. It was at Hewlett Packard, actually, before it kind of blew up, et cetera. But I'd been introduced by my advisor. The manager said, well, we're willing to pay you $2,235. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I made $3,000 last summer. This is less, but this is great experience. And Hewlett Packard will look good on my resume and my first engineering job. And then he says a month, and I'm just like, my head explodes. So I made something like $6,000 that summer, and it was phenomenal. Wow. Right? I was cover expenses, et cetera. But like a lot of people, I actually blew a good chunk of the money. I bought a new computer. I'll still defend the purchase of a Quadra 800 as a fantastic machine, but new computer, new monitor, a few extra things here and there, and lo and behold, I get to Thanksgiving and most of the money is gone. And I'm just horrified. How could I have spent that much money, et cetera? And so it turned out my grandmother, who had actually been a junior high school teacher, had retired. Not only had nothing better to do, but loved talking about, certificates of deposits and finding the best rate and mutual funds. I mean, this is the 90s. And so I just started learning from her. And fortunately, I was early enough in my academic career that I could actually take more coursework and actually invest in kind of that knowledge, not just, finance, but economics, accounting. I ended up going to business school eventually. And so it has been a little bit of a journey. But it didn't start with glory. It started with, making mistakes and then wanting to learn how to be better.
Yeah, I love that. Well, look, today's episode, we really want to pick your brains on what makes an incredible product leader. And there's no question on your success here, right? So your track record of Apple, eBay, LinkedIn, Dropbox, then going on as well to be the CEO of Wealthfront, on the board of Acorns, seed investor in Figma, it speaks for itself. So what I'd love to start with is, what have you learned about the difference between a good product team and an exceptional one on your journey?
Well, a lot of that, there's a lot that's always been spoken about talent and that goes without saying. Like, let's be clear. I do believe that product is a particularly difficult role. It's an interdisciplinary role, and it tends to feed on skills and knowledge from at least three areas. At least. In fintech, it might be more. But at least you have to have some kind of business and financial sensibility, strategy, et cetera. You have to have some technical background. You have to know what is and isn't possible. And I'm a big fan of design-centric thinking, right? Thinking like a designer, understanding who you're designing for. This also, all of these kind of extend into marketing, as it turns out. I'm the engineer who talks about what market segment you're targeting and, how do you reach them in distribution channels, et cetera. But, that talent is hard, and most people come into product with real strength in one of those three backgrounds. But they have to have enough humility and enough of a growth mindset that they're willing to learn and invest in the other two, wherever they're coming from. But my experience is that the difference between good and great in product really is leadership, and that talent is insufficient. If you take a lot of brilliant people, smart, ambitious, trustworthy people, which are the three attributes I think you have to have on your team. It turns out only two of the three is a problem. You want to have all three. But it turns out, really brilliant, ambitious, trustworthy people will go in different directions if they don't have some alignment, some coordination. Right. And I've always been a big believer that if you do heavy top-down orchestration and management, you end up sapping some of that energy and knowledge. Hopefully you're hiring people who know things that you don't, who can do things that you can't, who will have ideas that you won't. And so I became a big believer in harmonization and alignment through leadership, of sharing data and sharing frameworks. And I've written about this. You spoke earlier a bit on my blog and writing, but I remember one of my initial posts when I first moved into product from engineering and design. I was shocked at how little structure there was and how little guidance there was. It's one of the reasons I wrote about it back in the day. But great teams, there's three elements to a great team, I think, in the leadership. One is, have you set the strategy for the team in simple terms? I'm as big a fan of Michael Porter's 5 Forces and other strategic frameworks as others. But really, the simple thing you need to do for your team is tell them what game they're playing and how to keep score. I know it sounds obvious, but everyone likes sports analogies. But in sports, there isn't a lot of mystery, right? Yeah. In the end, people know what game you're playing. They know who the winner is going to be. We're watching the Olympics right now, right? There's no doubt who wins the race, fastest time.
But what form do you do that in? So let's start with this, laying out the strategy for the team. How do you do that?
Well, I think that there's two pieces to it. And what I've seen is that most product leaders get one of them right, but usually at the expense of the other. And it has to be both. So I've seen very metrics-oriented leaders who say, we're here to move this number, these three numbers. This is how we measure growth. This is how we measure engagement. This is how we measure revenue. I've been at companies where they want to optimize for cash flow, where they want to optimize for, revenue per employee. There's so many ways to measure business and business success. But a measurement without a framework, without a strategy, not only will be gamed. Everyone talks about that. But you're not even setting up a fair exercise, right? You're just literally saying, move the number. And you might not, your team may come up with ways of moving the number that aren't strategically advantageous. The flip side, I see a lot of people will talk about strategy, right? They'll walk through the steps of like, okay, we're going to do this, then we'll do that, then we'll win. They'll talk about, competitors, incumbents, changing the world, but never give their team a way of measuring, are they closer or farther from success? And that can be over different time frames. So, when I think of strategy, I do mean it literally, what game we're playing. You have competitors on the field, right? You're investing in certain advantages, right? There's something economically about what you're doing, about how you're creating value. And the best founders the best leaders, I've seen this as an investor, I've seen this as a board member, certainly as an executive and peers and managers I've had. The best leaders have a simple way of explaining that, okay, this is the market. This is where the competition is. This is the customer segment we're going after. This is the market we're going after. And this is how we're going to win. And the way we're going to know we're winning is by focusing on this problem first. I mean, by the way, strategy is the first piece of great product leadership, but the second one is prioritization, right? In theory, once you have the strategy and how to keep score, you should be able as a team to prioritize effectively. And in fact, when I step in as an advisor, or I've stepped into companies and I've seen them fighting about prioritization, it's almost always the root cause is because they haven't agreed on the strategy, right? People are playing different games. And so they're having arguments about prioritization because someone's saying, no, we're only going to win if we focus on growth. And someone else is saying, no, we're only going to win if we focus on engagement. And a third person saying, no, we're only going to win if we focus on the economics, on profits, on revenue. And that's really, and what happens is the prioritization fight becomes some sort of meta level fight, a staged battle. Really what they're arguing about is strategy. And so I think good leaders reverse that order completely. They start with the strategy. Everyone's aligned. They know how to measure it. You can then have thoughtful debates about prioritization because that's the hard part in software. You cannot do everything. You can only do a very small number of things well. And the most important question is, what are we doing next? Right. And it's hard. It's hard because you have to make hard choices and you have to explain yourself. But prioritization is the key. I mean, venture capital is phased for a reason. And there's time frames. What's the priority, this year, right, is a little bit tactical. And that's a leadership question. But, fundamentally, you have the prioritization, you line that up. And then you have the third piece for great product leaders, which is execution, which is the quality of the work they're doing and how they're making those choices. That one can be a little varied. Product managers have to be very flexible, in my experience, because the process is very complicated and it can be falling down in a lot of different ways. It can be for people reasons. It can be for process reasons. It can be for technology reasons. And great product leaders don't really care, right? They are built in the end to be judged by the final success of what they're doing, not the results. They're one of the few roles in a company where they really are graded on results. And so great product managers, when it comes to execution, step in wherever they're needed. Team is falling down on QA, quality assurance, they jump in there. If they're falling down on technology, they jump in there. Design, they jump in there. If it's just go to market, they jump in there. They really do whatever piece is missing so that the team can be successful.
Which speaks to the value of, having a diverse skill set. So there you touched on strategy, prioritization, and execution, right? Now you yourself have been a fantastic product leader and you've worked with some of the best, right? So is there a time that sticks out to you that kind of brings that to life in your career, whether it was at Apple, whether it was at your time at LinkedIn? What's an example of that coming to life that you can walk us through that sticks out to you?
Oh, there's really so many. I wish I could tell you it was easy, but every cycle, every product I've worked on, it's two sides of the same coin. There's always room for innovation and competition in the industry. We can always do it better the next time, but that usually means that the solution to the problem is rarely the same from one company to the next or one product to the next. But for me, every company, every experience has had an aha moment where I learned something valuable. In product leadership, I guess it's safe to tell the story now. When Steve Jobs passed away, I wrote up my own story like a lot of people did who were there when he worked about the most impactful meeting. And I talked about the big turnaround meeting that he led there.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, I didn't, it's funny. At the time, I didn't think as much of it. And it really didn't crystallize for me until I was at eBay. And eBay was going through their own turnaround of sorts. And I saw the different approach to leadership and the different guidance. And I wrote a bit about this when Steve Jobs passed away, about how different it was. And I think the results actually reflect that difference. So the Steve Jobs story, and some people have heard this before, but, it goes without saying, I know it's hard for anyone to remember. The 90s were not kind to Apple. right? So I thought I was joining Next, but during my interview cycle, Next got acquired by Apple, or maybe Next acquired Apple. I'm still unclear on what exactly happened. But fundamentally, I mean, Apple was going through problems. Sales were down, layoffs. I mean, the cover of Business Week at one point was, the fall of an American icon, like a black cover, like the Apple logo. The idea that Apple would ever be a $1 trillion company, it just wasn't even something anyone considered. But and it was sad. There were layoffs almost every week. There was actually a little restaurant called the Peppermill outside Infinite Loop. We would go on Friday afternoons to say goodbye to people. It was really sad. It's been replaced by a BJ's now, by the way. But in this talk, Steve got on stage. So as bad as Apple was doing at the time, Dell could not have been hotter. And Michael Dell was the wonderkin. I mean, out of his dorm, he's still amazing leader, entrepreneur, successful. And he had been asked in an interview, Michael, what would you do if you were running Apple? And he said something something along the lines of, there's some problems you can't fix. I would seriously consider liquidating and returning cash to shareholders, something like this. So the next day, there's a big meeting. The entire Rhapsody team. Rhapsody was the code name for what became Mac OS 10 and all the OSs we use now on the phone and iPad, et cetera. So a decent sized room, not thousands of people. I mean, but more than 100 people in this room. Steve Jobs gets on stage and he puts up on a giant screen Michael Dell's face. And he says, Michael Dell, one of the most successful business leaders, et cetera, thinks that you all wake up every day, come to work, you kiss your families goodbye, you get in your car, you commute to work, you come in here, and every day from 9 to 5, you destroy value. He literally thinks that if we shut the whole thing down and return cash to shareholders, that would be better than continuing to fund this team and this company. And you know what? He's right. If we keep doing the same thing everyone else is doing, we are going to fail. The world doesn't need another beige PC manufacturer. Dell does that really well. Compaq does that really well. That's not what Apple's for. And then he asked this question, what market share does BMW have? Which is a funny question because, by the way, Steve would sometimes ask questions you're not supposed to answer, rhetorical. Danger to answer one of these questions. And he said, no one knows the answer. The answer is no one cares. It's 1.5%, but who cares? Because you're either driving one or you're watching one when it drives by. And he talked about how Apple exists to make products that people don't just use, but that they lust after, that they love. He talked about acting like a startup again and giving people more stock options. He said he knew that this was a hard job, that this was not what everyone signed up for, and that if people wanted to leave, that was okay. And in fact, it would be better because it was going to be hard and the team needed to be focused because it was going to take years to fix what needed to be fixed. And it was an amazing thing because, it captured so many of those elements. I talk about, differentiation, strategy, market. He was explicitly saying that the hottest topic in the PC industry was not something he was focused on, and that was market share. I mean, to this day, by the way, you'll still see it in Apple DNA because Apple kind of reformed at that point. Apple does not focus on market share, despite the fact that it has some amazing winners, right? And these debates always go on. They focus on the product. They focus on profitability. That near-death experience, Apple has it in their DNA. They get the numbers right. It is not an accident that you're paying so much for memory still on computers and phones. It turns out people will pay, and they do. But I just thought it was phenomenal because having been, there are ups and downs at every company, every industry, and how you deal with those tough times. And it really was differentiated as a leader. And I realized that, Steve, I wouldn't think of him as a product leader per se. Obviously, Steve had a lot of unique attributes, et cetera. But I do reflect back on that meeting sometimes of what it takes to get people to come together and do something new and dangerous and risky. And the focus you need to have to do that. Sorry, go ahead.
What kind of impact do you think that's had on you as the way that you build companies, the way that you build products now?
Well, Every experience is different. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, the impact there was, one of the early debates that happened like 20 years ago, we talk about product management, is you start getting into that word in management. And it's a little funny. By the way, every product manager has this experience at some point, or certainly every engineer. There's that point where the engineers go, wait, I don't report to you. Why am I listening to you again? You're not my boss. And actually, by the way, when I joined LinkedIn, run core product, I had no one reporting to me on day one. We slowly moved pieces around and kind of reformed. I ended up building this team from some people who were at the company and some who weren't. And
was that was the mobile team that you were focused on?
Oh, no. At LinkedIn, when I joined core product, LinkedIn, like a lot of startups, had spent the first few years really experimenting, trying a bunch of things. Some things worked, some things didn't. By 2007, it looked like things were starting to really work. They'd had some things had moved on user acquisition. They had an SEO strategy that had started to work. The viral piece was starting to catalyze the network. It took a long time to build that network. It was very slow growing. I don't think LinkedIn got 1 million members. It was something like 450 days or something before LinkedIn even got to 1 million members. But it started moving. And I met Reid Hoffman in 2007. We had one of these breakfasts, kind of classic Silicon Valley thing. We met at a Hobie's in Mountain View. And by the way, it was not the best Hobie's. It was not there were better Hobie's. And it was not the best one. But we were supposed to meet for an hour. We ended up talking about product for 4 hours that morning for breakfast. But one of the things that we talked about was that, the big difference around product market fit, that there's this point for a company. In the beginning, you're guided a lot by founder intuition. You have a strategy, you're executing against it. You have a hypothesis, but you're constantly trying to make it work, right? And by the way, you're lucky if you were half right, right? Although to Reid's credit, he was more right than wrong on LinkedIn and strategy and the whole piece.
He got it.
He really is an
pretty
amazing
right.
strategic thinker. But we talked for 4 hours that once you start working with your customers, now all of a sudden you're getting real data, right? Not just customer feedback, not just user research, but you're getting clicks, you're getting metrics. There are actually ways. I'm a big believer that once a product and a company starts really growing, founders have to flip around and rediscover some humility around the fact that what you intended to build and where you thought value was may or may not be correct. And that your customers, the market, is telling you what actually was valuable about what you built, what was actually magical, what is actually differentiated. And it's not to say that you're getting rid of intuition. You can go too far towards data as well. But the biggest problem I've seen for companies at that stage is they're so used to making gut decisions that it's very hard for them to accept data that contradicts their assumptions. And so I was like, at LinkedIn, if you want LinkedIn to be huge, you're going to need people now who actually focus on what's working. You've built a company and a team where everyone wants to work on the new shiny thing, the new experiment, the 1.0, 0 to 1, right? Like everyone wants to do 0 to 1.
Yeah.
But it turns out when you actually build something successful, that's magical by itself. And having people who understand why is that successful, do more of that, actually is another skill set you have to build. And so I came in coming out of eBay, where I'd seen mistakes made, but also, great successes, et cetera, of saying, hey, with Web 2.0, we can do this better this time. And so I came in, they didn't have a design team, really. They had a few designers floating around and web developers. I formed the first user experience and design team there that was under core product, built that up, but really focused on the core features. I know this will sound ridiculous to anyone in 2024, but in 2007, no one at LinkedIn really wanted to work on the core features. They were so boring. Who wants to work on profile? We already did that. Who wants to work on search? I already did that. That's just for recruiters anyway, like high end. Who wants to work on, registration, right? I rebranded it the new user experience because I was like, this is actually our entry point. This is when you greet a customer for the first time.
This is important.
And so I spent a lot of time actually in those first couple of years just focused on trying to get LinkedIn to the point where the organization would continuously improve the features that represented 80% of the clicks. 80% of what customers were doing with LinkedIn were on pages that no one wanted to work on. And so I built teams that actually loved scale, loved growth, loved volume. And of course, we hit this crisis along the way. And so ended up forming the first growth team at LinkedIn as well, which of course became kind of the signature of that era, right? Web 1.0 companies had user acquisition and marketing, et cetera, like at eBay. In Web 2.0, Chamath and folks did growth at Facebook. And of course, my team did growth at LinkedIn. I took my best product manager.
Must have been one of the first few teams, right? One of the first great growth teams that you were building there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it was, by the way, it was a painful prioritization decision. Talk about this, right? We, like I said, one of the problems at Silicon Valley, if you don't actually know the people, if you don't actually talk to the folks who were involved at the time, is all these stories become beautified, right? Every story becomes like this incredible arc, and whirlwind success. The myth,
folklore,
supersedes the reality. But the truth is, LinkedIn was not a straight shot. I mean, at the end of 2007, beginning 2008, our growth flatlined. And what I mean by flatlined is we were adding quite a few members. I think 100,000, 150,000 a week. But that number wasn't getting bigger, right? And so if you do the math, that means that like your S-curve, you're just going to taper off. And it looked like LinkedIn was not going to get to the scale it needed to kind of fulfill its vision and do the things that we wanted to do. And so it was very painful. We had a very small team, core product. And one of the big arguments is, what do we do about it? And my belief at the time, still the belief, is that if something is really important for your company, for your product, for your strategy, you need to have a human being who's responsible for it, who wakes up every day. And that's the problem that they focus on. And user acquisition and growth, it's too easy for that to be a diffuse responsibility. Who owns it? Marketing used to own it. But wait, actually, the product has some growth to it. Maybe they own it too. There's sales folks over there. Do they own some piece of growth? Don't know. PR, do they have, comms? Do they have some role in kind of the brand? It's a little bit like who owns the customer, who's the voice of the customer. It ends up being somewhat diffuse. And so growth was like that. And so I was a big believer. So it was very painful. I had a very small team. I had just gotten my team to work on a redesign of profile, which no matter what you think of LinkedIn profiles, believe me, it was worse in 2006. And we were getting into all these features that people wanted. And I had to put that entire thing on hold. And I took my best product leader, a guy named Elliot Schmuckler, actually has his own company now, and said, okay, not working on profile anymore, engineers, designer. Your job is to go after growth. And growth is a very simple measure. How many new members are we adding per week? And Elliot, amazing mathematical mind. He also had been with me at eBay. He had actually suffered some of the same wounds and arrows that I had doing eBay Express. And so jumped on it, came up with frameworks, led the team. And that actually lasted, I think, easily more than a decade, but very painful. We had to put some core features that people care about on hold, right? Turns out people have opinions about LinkedIn profiles and how good or bad they think they are. And so the idea that we would take people off it to focus on something, and once again, growth, the idea that we would do it in product. But now what does everyone talk about in the industry? Product-led growth.
Yeah.
Right. So there you go.
Look, you're a trailblazer. And, one of the things that, I'd love us to dive into is your framework for product prioritization. But before we get there, so what I'm curious about, and especially with my time in fintech and financial services, there's something a bit different about building in financial services. But I wanted to get your take. So when you're building a product in financial services and you're dealing with people's money, what's different?
Well, I think there's a few things that are different. And it's funny, I believe this not only as an operator, but as an investor. And in fact, as an angel investor, I tend to invest at the seed stage or earlier. And so this is actually one of the few things that you can actually figure out very early. So, the three things I think that you're dealing with when you're dealing with money, the first is just a simple brand thing, but it's the most important brand thing, is to remember and never forget that almost all the value in our economic system stems from trust, and that money is a trust business, and that you have to always remember that what you do for your customers, how you behave, that they are trusting you with money. And that money is very often tied to not only work they spend in their lives, but also their goals for themselves and their loved ones. Like, it's incredibly important. And so I don't even think humility covers it. The burden you have to carry of saying, I'm building something worthy of that trust, right? You know, I'm a paint behind the refrigerator kind of guy. Like, it's what you do when people aren't watching. And so building a culture, building a product, building a brand around trust is incredibly important. I think the second thing comes down to economic value, right? You know, there is math. You can analyze money in a fairly objective way. I mean, emotions make it tricky, behavioral finance, et cetera. Sometimes a dollar isn't a dollar, and not everything is fungible, and not all risks are equal. But when I meet with founders, if I meet a founder in fintech who doesn't have a clear articulation of how they're creating economic value and for who, that's a serious problem, right? You can build businesses in financial services that are parasitic, where, well, people will pay for this. It's true. People pay for a lot of things that are not good for them. I mean, look at, food, industry, entertainment. So people pay for a lot of things that they're not good for them. But when it comes to money, that is not the path to building a sustainable business. Because eventually, I'm a big believer that those chickens come home to roost, right? Like, you have to.
And are you talking
value
at sort of a macro level, or are you talking at an individual level for creating value?
Both. I think you actually have to solve that problem, right? Like, and by the way, this is not just for fintech. One of my lessons from eBay, I wrote about this when Airbnb was young. One of my big lessons for eBay is do not underestimate for how many millions of people an extra few $100s a month, how meaningful that is. But actually, in my opinion, eBay learned that lesson late, of really understanding the economics of the sellers on their platform, not just how much they were paying in fees or listings or how much they're selling their products for, but no, what is the actual economic story, right? I remember I met once at an eBay Live. I met a woman who was selling cosmetics online. She had been a paralegal, and she was a paralegal, but she was there. She had kids. She wanted to send her kid, tested really well, wanted to send her child to a great school. And she was so grateful for eBay. I was working on this feature to sell wholesale. She was like, your feature, like wholesale on eBay is the reason I have just enough extra money every month that I can actually send my kid to this school. Maybe they'll work at a great company like eBay someday. And whatever you think of eBay, I'll say that it really hit home for me that, these products and services, they have to touch the economic reality of their customers. It has to create value, but it has to be true at a macro level too, right? This is not in a vacuum. If you're creating a system that's going to be outcompeted by other systems, once again, the goal in building a venture class business is sustainability and growth. It's not just growth, right? The real value is created by building a platform that lasts for decades. And so in financial services and fintech, you cannot do that without creating economic value, in my view. And then the third piece is actually regulatory, right? And when I say it's not just what the rules are and what the laws are, it's understanding how they came about, what their purpose is, what are actually almost every law and regulation. I believe, and this might sound hopelessly naive, so I apologize. There's a reason why I leave politics to a lot of other folks.
I said I wouldn't talk about politics.
No, I know, but fundamentally, I still believe that almost every law and regulation comes with a reason. And whether it was well executed or not, whether there's, some unintended consequence that made it a bad idea or a good idea, or maybe the people executing it aren't executing it well right now or in a way you don't agree with. But fundamentally, I actually do believe that almost all those laws and regulations had a positive intent at some point. That's how it got through in the process. And that understanding that is very, very important. And that's not something you have to worry about quite as much in other disciplines when you're building software, et cetera. But I think when you're dealing with money, it is foolish to not recognize that actually financial services, our ecosystem, our modern financial ecosystem has been around for a very long time, easily more than 100 years. And if you want to be generous, you can go back a couple hundred. And there have been plenty of people who wanted to make money in nefarious ways along the way. And our system really has grown up about understanding those lessons. And I think if you're a founder or a product lead in the area, you have to have internalized those lessons. You're building a product and feature to help people invest in the stock market or save money, etc. All these problems have existed for generations. And there have been abuses. And so I think that good people understand that history. And that's why actually, by the way, in my class, I teach this class, Personal Finance for Engineers at Stanford. With the book list, the books I talk about, many of the books I recommend are not financial books per se, but they're history books, right? Understanding the history of bubbles, understanding the history of great businesses or great investors sometimes can be more educational than actually just the math itself of how to build a diversified portfolio.
Yeah, I love that. So you've got brand and trust, essentially, and then you have economic value, and finally regulation. Otherwise, you're pretty much talking with the same set of tools and instruments to build a fantastic product. Speaking of building a product, when I was doing my research, so I spent some time speaking to your team, and they told me that your superpower, if there is only one, is being able to create a product that delights customers. Truly gets people excited, so they love and are passionate about your product. Can you help me and our audience understand, your process around building a product? So from the research through to feature prioritization to knowing when to scale. If you can break that down for us and explain how you do each stage well, because you're one of the people that wrote the playbook. Lots of companies do customer research, they prioritize their features, they try and scale, but not all of those become a Wealthfront or a LinkedIn or a Dropbox. So if you could break that process down for us, what goes into that for you?
I'd be happy to. And actually, there really are three pieces, I think, to this as well, that I lean on heavily. And by the way, I'd be the first to say, I don't think anyone has a reliable ongoing system for delight per se. There's a reason why, great musical artists, creatives in general have trouble creating magic over and over again. Although I do believe the advantage you have in software is that it's basically a team sport. So you have the advantage of always grabbing new people and finding those insights. But my three keys for delight, the first one's actually very simple. What do you even mean by delight? How do you define it? Delight became such a buzzword in the last 10 years. I found that most people don't even have a common definition. Now, my definition is an old-fashioned Apple definition of delight. I remember once I went to Kara Swisher has a code conference, or used to, and she interviewed all these wonderful people. And she would often get Tim Cook on stage. And one time she was needling him about, why don't you just tell people what Apple's releasing? Like, is it a TV? Is it a car? Like, everyone wants to know. Why don't you tell them? And Tim gave this very Apple answer, because Tim has been at Apple a very long time, all DNA, where he said, at Apple, we believe that consumers value surprise. And actually, I do think delight comes from surprise, right? The big difference between delight and a customer request is delight is that magic that happens when people weren't asking for it. It wasn't obvious. They're surprised by something that exists in the product. But once they see it, they can't unsee it, and they want to talk about it, right? That's just, oh, that's so clever. That's exactly right. And it's so important to have that surprise, because part of the myth making, I really believe, around building technology teams and companies and brands is a lot of people have an inherent wish to believe that there is a team somewhere of motivated people who are coming up with the future and coming up with the next best thing, the next great thing. And every time you delight them, you reward that story. You reward that narrative. Your fans become bigger fans, and they're excited they discovered you first. And your naysayers grudgingly have to kind of admit that maybe that isn't as bad as they thought it was. But they quiet down. And so that concept of delight, what I do with teams, the first thing is I explain that definition. I talk about that surprise, right? It can't be obvious that way. The second piece to delight, I think if you're going to execute against it, is to really know who you're designing for, right? There's that expression, if you design for everyone, you design for no one. It is so hard at startups. Startups are so desperate for customers, so desperate for growth, so desperate for any positive feedback that says that their thing is going to work, their company will succeed, the product is a good idea, that they grasp for customers everywhere, anyone. And Delight doesn't work that way. Delight is opinionated. It hits a market segment. And so the hardest conversation you end up having at a company, I think, is that idea of, no, we're going after this customer. And this is why I love frameworks, whether it's Clay Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma of understanding what markets are underserved. He would have said overserved, but that are kind of ignored, not the best customer of the incumbents. Even old Jeffrey Moore frameworks, Crossing the Chasm. Who are the early adopters? Making that, I'm a big believer in the beginning, you make a niche audience very excited about what you're doing. And then it grows kind of like bowling pins from there. So having that, who you're designing for, you cannot have delight. You can't really spark an emotional reaction out of everyone. You have to know who you're targeting. And then third is actually, I call it finding the heat. But when I was at eBay, was a great company, is a great company, and had really talented people on brand, people with great experience in CPG and other areas who knew how to build great brands over decades. But I was very frustrated in the brand meetings because they would only want to talk about positive attributes. I remember obnoxiously asking, I was young enough that I could ask, annoying, dumb questions. But, I was like, what about all the negative attributes people associate with the brand? How are we working on those? And I was frustrated that actually the focus was very much on amplifying the positive. But I don't think that's the way product work. I think humans are emotional, especially if you're designing for consumers. Obviously, we know this in finance, that people are emotional with money. I called it finding the heat, right? It was a little bit about what triggers emotion, both positive and negative, and finding ways to amplify the positive and finding ways to mute the negative. But the number one thing that adds value at that point on execution for things around delight is actually getting your team to talk about emotion. And I know that sounds obvious. I mean, my mother, by the way, is a clinical psychologist, so she, talk about your feelings is kind of built in. But but fundamentally, tech is filled, especially fintech, but tech is filled with a lot of very left-brained individuals, quantitative individuals. The engineers are certainly quantitative in math and science, and business folks tend to be quantitative, and they think in dollars and cents and spreadsheet and that sort of thing and margins. And your customer base, for the most part, isn't that audience. I mean, sometimes it is. Maybe you're designing for yourself. That's always a little easier. But usually they're not. And so to do delight, you have to really embrace this, what triggers emotion, and have it be okay that it's not rational, right? And it sparks things. And so those are the three things I tend to do. And I'm a big believer with delight, by the way, that I came to this late in my career. In the beginning, I used to think product was all about metrics. And then after a while, I realized, no, it can't just be metrics. It also has to be customer requests. You have to have a process for dealing with customer requests. But then I realized if you just do those two things, you'll make a product that hits its numbers. You'll make a product that your customers like to use, but they won't love you. And if you are competing, and by the way, it's a very competitive market. No free ride. Like you are competing with other companies and products and services. If you are competing with companies that do spark that emotion, you will lose more often than not. And this is why, by the way, in a lot of product categories, people hate competing with Apple. It is so aggravating. Apple will roll out a product years later that doesn't have better specs, that is 3 times more expensive, and people love them for it. Do you know how angry that makes some people? And the reason is because Apple does not delight their customers with every feature, with every product release. But every year or two, they do something where people go, oh, that's exactly right, or that's amazing, or that it sparks that myth making again. And Apple's been doing that for decades, right? And so a lot of the work I do with teams is making sure that not every sprint is about delight. It's not something you do with every product release, et cetera, but having those discussions and staying attuned to it so that when you have a delight idea, you write it down, you capture it, so that every now and again you can spend time doing features that just reward your biggest fans, your evangelists, the people who love your product irrationally, my experience has been if you do that on a regular basis, you will end up in a competitively advantageous situation and you'll have more durability when times get tough.
Well, tell me about this. Talk about Daffy now, right? Tell me about that through the lens of Daffy, right? So would love to hear about the problem that you're solving now with Daffy and using that, product as a bit of a lens on this process you've just discussed. Like, what is the customer insight you found? How are you delighting them? And who are those current customers?
Oh, these are both great questions. I love it. So, and obviously as a founder, proud story. I love telling the Daffy story, so I'm happy to do it. I mean, Daffy stands for the Donor Advised Fund for You, right? There's a little bit of a liability of having an engineer do the marketing.
Yeah.
DAFFY, Donor Advised Fund for You. I thought it was a good app name, et cetera. But the basic impetus behind Daffy was a really simple insight, which is that giving is really important to people. I mean, U.S., I think last year was something like $557 billion. It's like 2% of GDP. I mean, it's bigger than so many sectors. Huge amount. So clearly it's important. 60 million roughly households give to charity every year. This is a broad-based thing that people care about. And yet no one knew what a donor advised fund was, this great financial product. But more importantly, I saw financial planners. I saw it at Wealthfront. Somehow giving was never a financial goal. It was not something that people saved to buy a house. They'd save for retirement. But putting money aside for charity was almost, obviously people who are religious would often do this, right? Tithing, et cetera. Or
the only times I see it in wealth management, it's often a part of a tax conversation.
Yeah. But if you believe that financial advisors, financial planners are there to help people meet their financial goals, right, et cetera, it's hard to argue that this isn't one of them. This belongs not just on the budget, but in some sort of system. And so the original idea was like, what if we took all that great technology, all this innovation that we've spent in the last 10 to 15 years in the industry, helping people spend better, save better, invest better. What if we help them give better? And so I was on the board of Acorns, right? Acorns was a simple product, started with just rounding up your purchases, your spare change, but help now millions of people pay Acorns every year, a few dollars a month, to help them lead a healthier financial life, which I think is amazing. What if we could do that for giving, for this important goal? And so that's how Daffy was really born. And there's a lot of parts of the product I'm excited about and proud of. I'm proud of the business model and getting away from charging high fees for giving, et cetera. But you don't really learn what you need to know about a product until you actually talk to customers. And so I spent weeks actually talking to people all over the country. Basic customer development, right? 25 questions talking to people. And it was really illuminating because I was actually wrong about something. And then I discovered the thing that we ended up building Daffy around. So my first question to everyone was, how much do you think people should give to charity every year? And I was hoping that there were only 2 or 3 answers, right? It'd be something like, 10%, 2%, No, it turns out if you ask 25 people how much people should give to charity, you are going to get very close to 25 answers. Some people are in percentages. Some people are in numbers. Some people treat it like if you have a good year, right, you give back in good years. Not so good, maybe you need help. People think about it all different ways. And that's very hard when you're trying to design a product because a startup can't build 25 different products, right? The second question I asked people was, well, how much do you believe that you should give to charity every year? Now, I was looking for kind of a little bit of the, how do you judge other people versus yourself? This one was actually great and very classic for something that's a virtue. Most people had a bar for themselves that was as high or higher than what they thought other people should do. But that was exciting to me because what that showed is that people, sometimes it's the opposite. I think other people should do this, but I can break the rule. This was the opposite. This was like, I think everyone should do this, but I should do it more, was on average the answer. And people would talk about how they were more successful than average, or they had a good year, or that there were people in real need. They would almost always talk about a teacher, a priest, an uncle, a rabbi, someone who had instilled in them this idea that giving was part of a healthy life, that life was not meant to be fully selfish, and that giving was a way to remind yourself that it's not all for you. right? So that's good. That's when you're trying to design products that touch you emotionally. When you talk about delight, etc., you want something that touches emotionally. And people were telling stories from their childhood. That's a really rich vein for a product designer to design around. But then the third question was really the eye opener, because then when I asked, how much did you give to charity last year? Pregnant pause. Almost to a T, no one had met their own goal. And I realized that I'd seen this before, that this was true about every financial goal. How many of us would save for retirement if it didn't come out of our paycheck automatically, right? Like most financial planners know this, behavioral finance, I've known this forever. Commitment, pre-commitment, automation are the keys to hitting financial goals. We're just not built as humans to do things reliably over long periods of time. And giving is like that. Most giving, you want to support an organization or a cause. It's not just once, it's over time. But the problem is most people do not have time for giving. They have work, they have their family, they have personal life. There's all these things. Life is hard. There's a lot of things going on. And so most people end up giving mostly when someone else asks them. But it doesn't have to be that way. What if we just applied that basic idea of picking a goal? You join Daffy. The first thing it asks you, how much did you give to charity last year? What's your goal? Do you want to put aside $10 a week, $25 a month? Of course, we support high-end things. You can donate stock, crypto, mutual funds, ETFs. We support everything. But we try to keep it really simple. And then we help people hit their goal, right? It's a little bit like Apple Health. It's a little bit like the watch. Like, if Robinhood can give you confetti for trading stocks and crypto, we can give you confetti for giving money to charity or putting money aside or hitting your goal. And so a lot of what Daffy is about is rethinking the donor advised fund and saying, no, this isn't just a great financial product that makes a lot of tax sense. And I do believe that. I actually believe that anyone who gives to charity should probably have a donor advised fund. But actually, this is a better system for giving, right? If giving is something that matters to you, matters to your family, if you support, your church or your synagogue or a national cause or your alma mater or your kid's school, that's probably important to you. So just put it in place, set up a system, have all your receipts in one place, automate it. And the magic, and this is what we discovered, the magic with Daffy is having this app in your pocket that when someone does ask you to give, you can open up your phone, tap, 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 and boom, the money goes to the charity. Just like that. And the positive emotion that you feel of not just, wanting to give, but actually doing it. Like the action speaks louder than the words. We just constantly get feedback from our members that use case, that magic is really a big deal.
I love that, because the question that springs to my mind as you were talking me through that process is, when it comes to building a product, it's really hard if you tackle a product that is like convincing people to eat their vegetables. Something that everyone thinks is like, yeah, I know I should do that, but it's not top of mind. It's not a burning desire. You would have had the same problem at Wealthfront. You have this now at Daffy. Like, how do you play into that problem where you can actually change people's behavior?
Yeah, it's funny you actually use an analogy. Tom Perez, when he was Secretary of Labor, actually talked about Wealthfront. They were having the big fiduciary fight in Washington, and he quipped that Wealthfront had somehow made eating your broccoli cool, right? Like, how are you getting a bunch of young people to invest in a diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds? Was just phenomenal.
Thing ever. Yeah.
But no, I think there's some elements to it, but I think this is the play between delight and simplicity, and they usually fit together. Usually the best product ideas are very simple. And when it comes to money, remember, we talked about money being a trust business. It's much easier to trust something, an idea that's been around for a long time, right? I don't think it's a surprise that Acorns is as successful as they are, because the idea of saving your spare change as a way of having a little bit extra when you need it is a very old idea. I mean, I think the entire beginning of the movie, the Pixar movie Up, with no words, by the way, amazing emotional draw, like people cry in those first few minutes, is built around a little bit of this device of them constantly saving up for this future, and then one emergency happening, another, and breaking that jar open. And so when it comes to Daffy, I mean, we're talking about a very old idea, thousands of years old, right? The idea of putting some money aside for those less fortunate than yourself. I mean, we actually don't have to market very hard the idea that that's a good thing, right? Now, wrapping it in modern technology and saying, hey, there's an app for that. I mean, when we launched Daffy, we were the first fully functional donor advised fund in the App Store. This has just been a category that has not seen a lot of technology investment, let alone product investment. And so this idea that we could take all this innovation of the last 15 years and apply it to giving has really been why Daffy in the last, I mean, we're not even 3 years old at this point, but the number of firsts, the number of innovative features we've been able to execute against has been simply by saying, hey, we figured out how to delight people, how to create great features for all these other financial goals. Why not bring them over to giving? And then just make sure that we capture that human element, that the real heat that people have around building this into their life. I mean, when we, our 1 year anniversary, we rolled out family plans. And I know this sounds obvious. Every tech product has a family plan. Netflix has a family plan. I'm parent of 4 children. The number of requests I get on the Amazon family plan for is amazing. iTunes things, etc.
You've got a backlog.
I know, exactly. But fundamentally, but what donor advised fund has a family plan? None of them. And yet, if you talk to people about giving, they give with their siblings, with their parents, with their kids. They want to teach their children what it means to give. And so we added a feature where you can add family members to your donor advised fund, and they can request donations themselves, which you can approve or deny or edit. And they see when you make donations. And so now you can have real life conversations at the dinner table about why you give to who you give to. It's that spark. By the way, if you want to talk to children these days, it turns out an app notification is a pretty good technique versus trying to grab them unilaterally. I'll tell you as a parent. But and it sounds obvious, but it's also novel and new for the space. And so a lot of what we've been doing in Daffy, I mean, we launched with a lot of firsts. We're whether it was the native app, whether it was full crypto support. A lot of people love us for that on both contribution side or the investment side. Whether it's the family plan. Now we have campaigns. Anyone with an account at Daffy can run a matching campaign for up to 6 charities that they love. Right? What an amazing way to give. Instead of just giving directly, you can match dollar for dollar and inspire other people to give. So it's a fun area to work in. And I think it's a fun area because, one, of course, everyone here believes in the mission. This simple idea of helping people be more generous more often is really an easy thing to align behind and get people excited about. But it is fun to be a technologist in an area where there's been so little investment in technology. It's like a playground.
So much, yeah, exactly. And also, the other thing that I love about this is financial services seem to get it wrong all the time, but it's such an emotional, taboo subject, money. And yet especially the incumbents continue to talk about themselves, continue to talk about products and features. So I love the story of Daffy and excited to see what's next. I just want to finish, Adam, today on unpicking some leadership lessons from you. One of the big questions specifically that comes up from our audience of listeners is about making a step change in your career. Typically, like, how do I go from that VP to the C-suite? How do I go from that C-suite to the board? And not just, it's not really how do I get there. It's like, what do I do when I land? Like, am I going to be able to cope? And the answer and I ask this to all of my guests, the answer I always get is you need mentors. And you need a mentorship to help you, give you some support, encourage you, and make sure you get through that. You've had some of the best mentors out there and, have spoken at length about your mentorship with Reid Hoffman. You've also worked for Andy Rachleff. What an amazing, sounding board to have. So I just wanted to ask you about your views on mentorship. As a leader, what do you think the value of the mentorship is? And do you have any examples from Reid or any other mentor that you can point to as, game-changing advice for you?
It's funny. I might be a little counter to conventional wisdom here. But I worry sometimes that there's an unavoidable truth that actually most leaders do have mentors. They have people who inspired them, taught them, took a little bit of extra time to talk them through things or explain things to them and set them on a path. But I worry sometimes that people try to manufacture that, and it's not something easy to manufacture. And in fact, I'm not sure it is the most impactful thing. To me, you can learn an amazing amount by just being observant and being a rigorous student of leadership. Right? A mentor, you want to align with them. You want to agree with them. And that's why it's a very weighted word. But when it comes to leadership, it's a little bit of the right place at the right time, the way they handle things, that balance between kind of how they lead the team, the strategy they put in place, the execution. And there's many different styles. I mean, you see this, by the way, in venture capital, where what makes a great venture capitalist? Well, it turns out there's more than one model. Right? Actually, you can look at very successful venture capitalists. They're not all the same. And the same thing is true in business leadership, because there's so many different types of business out there. And actually, some of being a great leader is having the humility to know what games you're great at and what you're not. Where you are the best leader and where actually maybe someone else should be the leader, right? Because it's a different type of game. I mean, Reid Hoffman for me is a good example. I mean, of course, you couldn't ask for a better mentor than Reid Hoffman on a number of different dimensions. But the reality is my closeness to Reid is not a mentorship relationship. He hired me. We worked together. He made a bet on me, and I made a bet on him, and I made a bet on his company, and he made a huge bet starting that company. And so there's something to be said about colleagues, about managers. We all have different managers and leaders. Some are great, some are not. But I'll tell you, some of my least favorite managers, when I say least favorite, I'm being very generous in the words I'm using. People if I'm intellectually honest, I learned some things from them, because even though I didn't like them as a manager, there was a reason why they got to where they were. And there were lessons to be learned. And so I just think those lessons are all around you. And so I would probably advise people to focus a little less on mentorship and a little bit more of that self-reflection of what type of leader do they want to be, and building that catalog of experiences, both secondhand and firsthand, where they actually try these things out and do them. I learned so much about leadership at eBay, at LinkedIn, at Wealthfront, at Dropbox, now at Daffy. I'm learning things because you're always putting these new hypotheses in place, seeing how they work out, and hopefully improving. And so that growth mindset, that idea that you're never done, you're always learning and improving, I think is important. But I like looking at leadership. One of the reasons there are a few conferences that I would go to, because in general, I'm not a huge fan of conferences in terms of, their value add in terms of getting work done and building product. Yeah. But the conference I tend to bias to is where I felt like I was getting an honest appraisal from real leaders about real situations that they were in. I know that's one of the goals of this podcast. But fundamentally, I really believe that the best leaders, if you talk to them, whoever you think is a titan of industry, they have stories, and they're not from mentors. They have stories of leaders that impress them, either biographies they read, people they saw speak, or in some cases, they were just starting out in their career, and there was this executive that they just thought was running things exactly the right way. And I really think that the best leaders take leadership seriously. Like it's an area of study. It's something to spend time thinking about. This is one of the reasons, Clay Christensen passed away, unfortunately, years ago, but I remember he opened up his class, always not talking about strategy, not talking about case studies. You know what he talked about? He talked about the moral and ethical responsibility of being a leader, being a manager, how people spend most of their waking hours at work, and a terrible manager can ruin someone's day-to-day life. And a great one can really bring out the best in their life. And that actually great managers and leaders have a responsibility for people's real lives. And so I think the best leaders pay attention to the folks who do that well. And they're always pushing themselves to kind of incorporate what's natural, what makes sense for them and their leadership style.
Well, I think that's fantastic advice for everyone listening today. Now, my final question, and then I'll let you go back. I'm sure you've got a lot on building a startup as a founder. My final question now is, the VC climate is very different. You've been bold and brave enough to dive straight in and found and build a business. What's your advice to other founders in this current environment? Most founders I speak to are currently still dealing with how you focus on profitability over growth, how you deal with being more cautious around when and where and who you raise money with. What's your take, and what's your advice for someone building a business, fintech business today?
Well, I think, listen, there are definitely environments where some things are easier, some things are harder, and vice versa. Having been through so many cycles, I grew up in Silicon Valley, like so many cycles. I think this is my fourth tech downturn that I've had to be through and help navigate. And some things are different each time, and some things repeat. History rhymes, as they say. And so, when I talk to founders right now, I really encourage them to remember that at the end of the day, their goal is not to raise financing per se. It's not to hit a specific number or a certain amount of ARR. Their actual goal is to build a great business and build a great venture class business. And a venture class business is incredibly difficult to build. There are tens of millions of businesses in the US alone, and 99.99% of them are not venture class businesses. The idea of building not only a company of that scale, but building a company of that scale that quickly is a very, very rare opportunity. And so when I hear in recent days, founders worrying about revenue, worrying about profitability, part of me is like, well, good. It turns out building
seems like a smart thing.
Well, a sustainable business, you have to have a point of view on that, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to build. You're not going to build a venture class business to scale that doesn't have good unit margins or that doesn't have good revenue growth and can't make money. But I always am worried when people get overly focused on one number or one aspect of the business. For example, you just mentioned it. If you deliver a business that is profitable but not growing, that can be a good business for you and your team. It's possible. It doesn't sound like a venture class business, right? So sometimes you can win the battle and lose the war, right? You survive, but you're no longer building a venture class business. And so I really do encourage founders to always remember that the industry, it feels like it just moves around. It's a little whipsawed. It's a little bit more cyclical than you'd think. Isn't building companies for the long term? Why are we worried about where interest rates are in 2024? Aren't we building a company that's supposed to be huge in the year 2034? But the reality is that the capital markets do affect the different risks people take and the duration. We are discounting back from the future. And so I just always encourage founders to make sure that they have clarity. Once again, going back to that basic definition of strategy, what game are you playing and how do you keep score? Some of the best businesses out there had a lot of confidence in their long-term profitability and scale. LinkedIn is a great example. I was talking the current CEO, Ryan Roslansky, fantastic leader. LinkedIn is now over 15 billion in revenue, incredibly profitable. But back in 2007, almost no one thought LinkedIn would make money or be even 1/10 that scale.
Yeah.
And by the way, LinkedIn did not heavily focus in the early days. They had a mythology. Read was very good. Growth, engagement, revenue. Every year, which one is the top priority focus? And there were years that LinkedIn focused on revenue, but mainly in the early years, it was very much on growth, sometimes on engagement, right? But that's because that was part of the strategy. LinkedIn was a network effects business. You could think of it as a platform if you got it to sufficient scale. The economic value of that platform was phenomenal. And we had a lot of confidence we could build businesses over it. And so this is the dilemma, I think, as a founder, is that the market changes. And you have to always be asking yourself, does your hypothesis still hold? Seed memos, one of the great things, I've worked for venture capital firms. And the best venture capitalists do write up memos, even when they're by themselves, on why they're making an investment and what the thesis is and the play. And what I've noticed is that a lot of successful founders, whether they know it or not, they have that thesis in their head. I would encourage them to write it down. But the best founders are always iterating on that hypothesis and asking, does my theory still hold? My theory that there could be a venture class business in this area built around this product. And if it's not true, well, it turns out that it's on you to steer the company, right? And so you either have to steer it in a new direction. I mean, we mentioned Wealthfront. No one should forget Wealthfront started as a company called Ka-Ching.
I remember a game on
It was
Facebook.
a game. And it was actually a very clever idea in some ways. It was like, oh, people compare their different portfolios. Yeah. Eventually we'll create a marketplace where advisors can come in and manage money, and clients will be able to pick the best managers, et cetera. And managers will get like fantastic. And they actually got to hundreds of thousands of people playing this game and using it. But it wasn't a business. And when they tried to get money into the platform, it was very difficult. And their pivot to Wealthfront, has now become kind of one of those stories that people learn. But founders do that. So sometimes the answer is to trudge ahead. Even in the dark days for LinkedIn, Reed's confidence in the basic strategy and theory behind LinkedIn was very consistent, and we executed against it well and got through the hard times and built an incredible business. And sometimes the path is you have to admit that hypothesis doesn't work. But what you've learned is something that tells you that there is a venture class business in a different direction. And that's what founders have to navigate, not just every 5 years or every 10 years, but really, every year. I actually update our strategy memo at Daffy every 6 months. Not radical changes, but what did we learn in the last 6 months? What did we confirm? What changes do we have to make? And I write it down and I share it with the entire company, because I think that is one of the ways a leader can help align the entire team and make sure that they're learning together, not just about the product, not just about their customers, but about what type of company they think they're building.
And to make sure you have your own clarity of thought. Adam, what a fantastic way to finish this episode. I'm so grateful for you joining us. And also on behalf of the million plus Finimize community that I know love the fintech products you've built and the impact you've had on the world. Thank you for building those products and bringing them to life. I wish you the best with Daffy.
Yeah, and well, I'll tell you, same open offer to you and to those to the people listening. Daffy's still new. We're very proud of what we built, but don't be afraid to try it. Certainly appreciate hearing what we're doing right. But if there are things you think we could be doing better, I want to hear it too. I'm incredibly excited about taking all of this knowledge, all this excitement, and channeling that energy towards helping people be more generous and do something really important for themselves, which is giving.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Well, what a fantastic way to end a very valuable episode. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, from me personally, but also the Finimize community. The millions of people that read our content, I know have got value from the fintech products that you've built over the years. Adam, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you soon.